Hey, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you about the recent events in the...
Sir, thanks for your time. Particularly when it comes to the mirages that were brought on scene, do you have the sense now that anything has changed now that you're back doing operations? Is there any kind of shift here in what they're allowed to do with their authorities or the coalition? With how quickly can you get air support?
Okay, just on the issue of authorities, I just want to make it clear that U.S. forces and coalition forces in the area, when it comes to an issue of force protection, self-defense, don't have any limitations. They don't have any limitations. So that's been something that's been discussed. And so, you know, with regard to employing fires, if there's an issue of self-defense, we have the inherent right to do that, and we will do that.
Were there limitations that night?
I am not aware of that. I've seen speculation. I don't have any evidence of limitations during that particular night. But again, if there were, the investigation will certainly tease that out. I've seen open source reporting to that effect. I don't have any information in the operating chain that would indicate that there were limitations. Now, when I say limitations, you know, part of the requirement is obviously the ability to integrate, and I don't know whether there was any challenges integrating. I don't know why the Mirages didn't drop bombs during those initial passes. I don't know if the unit on the ground asked them to do that. Those are things we'll find out in the investigation.
Just a couple clear points. One, you mentioned RPA was on the scene, they said within minutes. Was that French, American?
That was American, and it was retasked. It was operating in the area anyway, and so we were able to retask it, and that's why it was available in minutes. It was literally in the air, in the area, and we were able to retask it directly in support of that unit that was in contact.
Was that an armed system, and did it strike?
It did not strike. It did not strike.
Did it have the possibility?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about what our capabilities are in the region, but that particular capability that was there within minutes did not strike.
Thank you, General. Jennifer with the U.S. Agent of Korea. On President trip to South Korea next month, and he visit to DMZ, but President Trump has not yet made any decision to visit to DMZ next month. Who make this decision, and it's a Korean government or U.S. government?
Yeah, I don't know the details of the president's itinerary later this month, or what decisions he's made about the DMZ.
But President visiting DMZ as a commander-in-chief of the United States, it's good for the sending any kind of message.
I'm going to leave it to President Trump and President Moon to decide whether or not the president ought to be in the DMZ.
Clarify what you were saying about
Sure.
the drone. Does that mean you had complete visibility of the situation? There was a drone up above within minutes?
We had a remotely piloted vehicle that was in the area. It was a U.S. remotely piloted vehicle. As soon as they asked for help, within minutes it was retasked to provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, full motion video, one of the capabilities, right over the troops in contact.
And how long was it able to stay above?
Jennifer, I don't know how long it stayed, but I certainly can get that for you. I don't know how long it was on station at that particular time.
So did they request specifically ISR, or did they request help and then you guys sent ISR?
They would have in the normal course of events. I haven't seen the logs. We'll have all that teased out in the investigation, but in the normal course of events, they would have asked discreetly for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and then also supporting fires and specific effects that they wanted to achieve. So I think they would have had a more detailed request.
Have you viewed the video?
What's that? I have not viewed the video.
On the evacuation, you had the wounded evacuated, of course, first, and then the killed in action. Do you know yet whether anyone did a head count on either of those aircraft or after those evacuations were done to be sure that everybody was accounted for?
I don't have that level of detail in terms of who counted. You know, I mean, I know what the procedures would normally be. I can't tell you if those procedures were followed at that particular time. Again, that'll be something that'll come out in the investigation. Yes.
General, will the Pentagon be increasing the tempo of missions in Africa? Can we expect to see more deployment of troops into Africa, changes in the ROE?
Yeah, I think it's premature to talk about what additional troops or changes in ROE would make. Look, we're watching very carefully with the fall of Raqqa and Mosul what the enemy will do. You see that. In fact, that's one of the reasons I have 75 chiefs of defense or their representatives that are here tonight, is to talk about the next phase of the campaign. I described it as an inflection point. One of the places that we know ISIS has aspirations to establish a larger presence is in Africa. We know how important Libya and the Sinai have been to the Islamic State. We know how much they have tried to get into East Africa, and of course, the scenario we're talking about here today in West Africa. So we're watching that very carefully, and we are going to make recommendations to the Secretary and to the President for the allocation of forces that meet what we see as the threat, what we anticipate the threat to be. But I certainly wouldn't talk about what we will do tomorrow at this moment.
For now, have the combatant commanders or the chiefs made any recommendations to the White House to change troop numbers, tempo, ROEs?
Yeah, to the White
Has
House
spoken with
to
you
the
about
White
that?
House, no. But one thing I would tell you, just to make sure that we're clear, we get requests for capabilities on a routine basis. They come to me, and then we frame those for decision by the Secretary of Defense. So there's constantly requests for capabilities that go back and forth between the combatant commanders and the Secretary. I mean, I don't think a week goes by when we don't work a request from the combatant commanders to do that. And sometimes it's a question of reallocating capability. If you were talking Africa, we'd reallocate it either from European Command or Central Command, and then reallocate it back when a particular mission is complete. But that kind of activity happens all the time. I think what you're really talking about is a much more sustained presence with a larger footprint, and there's been no discussion, nor has there been a request for that.
For the troops that are on the ground right now, has there been discussion of increased tempo?
There has not. There has not. Tom? Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for doing this. Sorry for cutting you off earlier. You said that the patrol overnighted from October 3rd to October 4th. Was that part of their mission plan that they put up and that headquarters understood was going to happen?
Yeah, I don't have the details of that. I don't know whether it was intended that they would, how long it was going to take, or if they had planned to stay overnight. And just to be clear, I think a probably more accurate description than stayed overnight was they caught a couple hours of sleep after the 3rd and before they completed their mission on the 4th.
Is there an investigation beyond the 15-6 into the troop deaths? And then what's the significance of the FBI being called in?
Sure. On the first case, no. There's an investigation that's being conducted by a general officer at the United States Africa Command into the incident itself. So that's the only investigation, U.S. military. With regard to the FBI, it's fairly normal in counterterrorism cases for them to conduct investigations to get information and intelligence that may be related to threats to the United States, and I believe that's the capacity in which the FBI is conducting an investigation right now.
So a quick follow-up on whether or not the troops were wearing body armor, the U.S. forces?
Yeah, I don't personally know how the soldiers that day were equipped, if they were wearing body armor.
More broadly, you talked about the difficulty of next of kin notification. Obviously, there's a big political discussion right now about the right way to do that. Could you talk generally on just the difficulty, the challenge of conveying to American families when their loved one is lost what they died for?
Yeah, I think what you just zeroed in on is one of the things that we try to do when we do this, and I've certainly had to do it myself, is you want the family to understand the why. And so I think one of the most important things that we would try to do in this particular case is be able to explain how what their loved ones were doing was related to the protection of the homeland in dealing with the threats that we confront. And frankly, I think in this particular case, we'll be able to do that.
Following up, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll come back.
Following up, Sergeant Johnson's widow said this morning in an interview that she had asked to see her husband's body, but had been told no. Is that the case? Is there a reason why?
Yeah, it's not, first of all, I did hear that this morning, and what typically happens, and again, I've been involved in these cases myself, is there are times when we make a suggestion to the family that they may not want to review the remains. At the end of the day, the policy is it's the family's decision as to whether or not they do that. So I can tell you what the policy is. I don't know what happened in the case of Mrs. Johnson, but we'll certainly find that out. But I did hear her say that today, and certainly, again, from a policy perspective, we would typically defer to the family's desires, and we do that. But I don't know exactly what happened in the exchange with Mrs. Johnson and what would have normally been the casualty assistance officer that would have been supporting her.
As a follow-up, if it does turn out that she was not given the option to view her husband's body, is this something that you will be looking further into?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speculate whether that causes me to speculate what exactly happened. But I can assure you that if Mrs. Johnson or any of the families of the fallen are unsatisfied with the support that they've had to date or have additional questions, we're going to go to every last length to try to satisfy their concerns or answer their questions. I mean, that's what we do in each and every one of these cases. With Mrs. Johnson, certainly with all 4 of the fallen in this particular case, and frankly, anyone in the department that gives their lives on behalf of our country, we're going to try to do everything we can to answer those families' questions.
Sir, just to follow up, who found Sergeant Johnson's body? Which force?
There's initial reports, and again, my understanding is the body was reported by Nigerian forces to U.S. forces. And I'm going out on a little bit on that one because I feel pretty comfortable that that's what the reporting was. But again, from the investigation, we'll get the final details. But that's the initial report right there in the back. I'm sorry, I'm going to come back.
So as ISIS decentralizes and the U.S. military looks to partner with a number of partner nations to attack it across this global network you've described, should the American people expect to start hearing about incidents like this in countries outside of Iraq and Syria and places they're maybe not familiar with?
Well, again, in this particular case, we've been operating there for many years. And this is a tragic incident, but it hasn't been a matter of routine. So if you're asking me, is it going to be a matter of routine that we suffer casualties in places other than Niger or outside of active area of hostilities, I would tell you no, it won't be a matter of routine that we'll suffer casualties. We will, unfortunately, in a war that has been described as a generational war, have additional casualties in the future, and we'll do all we can to mitigate it. But when we're conducting these kinds of operations, which we call train, advise, and assist, we don't, under the normal course of events, accompany those local partnered forces when contact with the enemy is expected. So we do one of two things. We either stay back at what we call the last cover and conceal position, right? So that's before enemy contact is made, or we don't even go on an operation if enemy contact is made. Outside of active hostilities, our focus is to enable local forces to be able to conduct operations against the enemy. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Fair to say that the war on ISIS is shifting right now to Africa?
I think it's shifting. I'm not sure I'm ready to say it's shifting just to Africa. We're dealing with a challenge that exists from West Africa to Southeast Asia. We've seen manifestations of it in Europe. We've seen inspired attacks here in the United States. So we're dealing with a global challenge. I believe that ISIS will attempt to establish a physical presence outside of Iraq and Syria now that they have lost their caliphate in Raqqa and Mosul. They will attempt to establish, and that's exactly why we're conducting the kind of operations we're conducting in Niger, is to ensure that local forces have the capability to prevent that from happening.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for about 2 more questions.
Courtney?
Yes, thank you. Does part of the FBI investigation include interviewing the wounded and the soldiers who were there at the attack back here in the U.S.?
You know, we'll have to get back to you. I don't actually know the details of the FBI investigation. I'm very familiar with the U.S. military investigation, and the general officer that's been assigned to do that investigation will interview everyone that was there, anyone that has any information about the incident that took place on the 3rd and 4th of October. But I can't talk about the FBI investigation.
Can you just give us a time from the initial troops in contact until the Americans were taken out of the area? What was the total time of this entire engagement? Do you have that? How many hours?
What I can tell you, Courtney, is that it was mid-morning local time in Niger on the 3rd of October when this all began. And it was the evening local time on the 6th of October when Sergeant Johnson's body was recovered. So there was ongoing operations throughout that period of time. In the back there.
Sir, thank you very much for doing this. If I could have one and then a follow-up. Will the investigation be able to look into what French intelligence or French military activity there was or may have been in the area of the attack, leading up to the attack?
Absolutely, absolutely. Our investigating officer will absolutely engage our French partners and interview the French soldiers that were involved. I'm sure he'll interview the crews that were called in to provide support, to include the rotary wing attack helicopters, as well as the fixed wing. So I don't have any doubt that all the information that the French have available will be shared with our investigating.
It's classified intelligence on their side?
That's happening every day. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we are we are integrated in conducting operations with the French. We are partnered with them there. So we have complete transparency in sharing information in West Africa with the French.
And if I could just follow up really quickly, you mentioned national assets that deployed from the United States. Without specifying what those national assets were, can you say if any of them actually reached Niger before the situation was resolved?
Honestly, I'm not going to address that. I do want you to know that we have things, I think many of you are familiar with those things, but we have national assets, and as soon as we had a missing soldier, we brought those assets to bear, but I'm not going to talk the details or the type of capability.
Sir.
In the back there.
Sir, should the American public be prepared for the loss of more U.S. troops in Africa?
Yeah, what I would tell you is that the majority of our operations in Africa are designed to support the training, advising, and assisting of local African partners. And we mitigate the risk to U.S. forces with specific guidance that we will only accompany those forces when the prospects of enemy contact is unlikely. There are other areas in Africa where we have a different construct. So what I just described to you is the construct that exists in West Africa. Clearly, and you've seen it in recent days, we have a different type of operation against Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and Al-Qaeda organizations inside of East Africa. So, we tailor the conduct of U.S. forces based on the threat. The bias in Africa is to support local forces in dealing with the threat. Where there is a threat to the U.S. homeland, American people, or our allies, we're going to do whatever is necessary to address that particular threat. So if we had, let me just be clear and use an example. If we have a specific threat to the homeland and local forces are unable to deal with that threat, United States forces are going to deal with that threat. But the bias is towards enabling local African partners to conduct operations in Africa.
Clarity on the timeline on the medevac, sir. How long did it take before the casualties were medevaced, and then how long did it take before the dead Americans were returned on the contractor flight?
Okay. What I outlined for you earlier was the evening of during the firefights. This is probably sometime late in the afternoon, then into the evening, is when the two soldiers who were wounded were evacuated. What I don't have is the specific time when they were wounded. So if you're asking for a time between when they were wounded and when they were evacuated, I don't have that. And in terms of the soldiers that were killed in action, they were evacuated in the evening, that's local time in Niger, in the evening on the 4th of October. Okay? All right. Hey, thanks. Thanks. Actually a fairly historic day. We had representatives from over 75 countries and also NATO and the European Union to discuss the challenges of violent extremism. And this is the second time we've done it. Last year we had a little over 40 nations, and this year almost 75. And literally we walked the globe today with discussions that involved West Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the networks that actually connect violent extremist organizations from the Western Hemisphere to Southeast Asia. I think some of the conclusions were, one, that we are dealing with a trans-regional threat, and it's going to require more effective collective action by nations that are affected. One of the anecdotes is that in Syria and Iraq, we saw as many as 40,000 foreign fighters from 120 different countries, which gives you some sense of the range of ISIS's challenge. Although today primarily spoke about ISIS because we view that today as the most virulent strain of violent extremism, we really are talking about a military network that we expect to be enduring to deal with all forms of violent extremism, ISIS and Al-Qaeda today, but any trans-regional threats. I think to summarize, probably the key takeaway is we realize that the most effective action against these groups is local action, but that local action has to be informed by the nature of the threat, which is a trans-regional threat, and so cooperation globally is important. And then also our global efforts have to be informed by those local information as well. The things that we talked about that connect these groups are three. One is the flow of foreign fighters. Two is the flow of finances or resources, and three is the narrative. from a U.S. perspective, and frankly, I think from this military group, we realize at the strategic level, the idea is that we would cut the connectivity between these groups. Again, West Africa today, and we spoke about the various locations where these groups operate, but cut the connective tissue, if you will, those three enabling functions, and then enable local forces to deal with the challenge. And that's what we spoke about today, is enabling these local coalitions to deal with the challenge. I'm going to let Mr. McGurk make 1 or 2 minutes of comments as well, but I think you all have come down here late in the day, and so we'll take the time to answer your questions. And for you hardy souls that actually did come down here, we'll make sure that we answer everybody's question before you leave. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. McGurk. Thanks.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. It was a real honor to be here, and this really was a historic gathering of Chiefs of Defense, and it was also an opportunity to just review a little bit where we are in the overall campaign against ISIS and talk to many coalition members here. Our coalition against ISIS, of course, is a subset of the group that we met with today, but it's really the largest coalition of its kind in history. 69 countries now, 3 international organizations, the Arab League, the EU, Interpol, and NATO. NATO is our newest member that joined during the NATO summit this summer at the invitation of President Trump. And I was just in Brussels and briefed the North Atlantic Council, and all 29 allies were prepared to contribute even more to the overall campaign, answering the President's call. I think if you look at some statistics in the overall campaign, we've now cleared about 90,000 square kilometers. ISIS is down really to its last 10% of territory. About a third of those gains, a little more than a third of those gains now have come over the past year. It's a more accelerated campaign thanks to many of the accelerants that were authorized by the President earlier this year. Importantly, ISIS has not regained a single meter of that territory. That's a record that we're very proud of. Everything that has been retaken from them has held. And over 6.6 million people have been liberated from ISIS overall in this campaign. And we talked today quite a bit about the civilian-led efforts of the campaign, which go hand in hand with the military efforts. We have a stabilization humanitarian parallel effort that goes with every military campaign, and it has helped return people to their homes. So in Iraq, for example, we have now 2.3 million Iraqis have returned to their homes in areas that had been liberated from ISIS. And we're starting to see a similar trend line in Syria. Foreign fighter flows into Syria nearly stopped. There was 40,000 just a few years ago. Those flows have nearly stopped. And also foreign fighters are unable to get out of Syria, and we believe we've cut their revenue down to the lowest level ever, and their outside sources of funding are now entirely severed. Most interestingly today, I thought we did, as the chairman said, a little trip around the globe, because it's not just about Iraq and Syria. Well, that gets so much of the attention. We had very detailed presentations about operations against ISIS in Malawi, in the Sahel. We talked about how we're tracking foreign terrorist fighters around the world, making sure that we catch them if they're trying to cross borders, trying to target our homelands. And I had a very good presentation from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the very important leading efforts that they have taken on, both counter ideology and really leading the counter messaging campaign in that part of the world. So it was a very constructive, very poignant, I think, moment in our overall campaign against ISIS, as we also look to shift to a new phase in the overall effort.
General, could we start with Niger, if you don't mind? There were some reports today that the mission for the U.S. service members in Niger did change. They were going after a high-value target, and that another special operations group was supposed to join them and did not, but they were ordered to go in any way. Can you comment on those reports or confirm?
The only thing I can tell you is what we discussed last night, and that is, those are the kind of questions the investigation is designed to uncover. And once the investigation is complete, we'll address those and the other issues that have been raised.
But you can't comment specifically on whether or not their mission changed?
I can't, because again, anything that you've seen in that regard is speculation, and once the investigation is complete, we'll have the facts and we'll share that. One of the things I'm just sensitive to on Niger, as I mentioned last night, I just want to reiterate it now, is the very first people that we want to sit down with and share the facts are the family once the investigation is complete. And we want to do that once, and we want to do it right. And then immediately thereafter, we will get the Pentagon team together, and we'll share it with you and the American people. But there's so many bits and pieces of information that are coming out, some speculation, some bits of fact. We want to make sure we have the whole story. We have the whole story in context. We can provide the facts to the family. That's my primary target audience right now, the loved ones, and they have legitimate questions about what happened, and we're going to answer those questions. And then this full range of questions to include this one, we will address, and we'll address it fully.
Can I, Mr. McCurk, in your capacity, are you tracking the movement of ISIS into Africa?
Yeah, part of our campaign is to try to track the movement and flow of foreign fighters. And in fact, we had a very good discussion today about how we do that globally, how we share information better, and how, as a coalition, we've actually stopped attacks by trying to connect dots. So, yeah, certainly. And with the effort in the Sahel, which was a part of the conference today, is really about trying to block these migrant flows, which the extremist groups are trying to take advantage of.
So what kind of flows are you seeing from Iraq and Syria, for instance, into Africa?
Iraq and Syria, the flow has almost stopped. So yeah, you can look at just look at ISIS's own propaganda. About a year ago, they started to stop saying come to Syria. At the time, they said go to Libya. Then they stopped saying go to Libya. They said go to Philippines. Now they can't go to Philippines. So they're running out of places to go.
Let me just follow up, because it's less about numbers, I think, in some cases, than small numbers of leaders, individuals that maybe add to the insurgency. If you took a look at the Philippines, for example, we got a brief today in Malawi and from the Vice Chief of Defense of the Philippines. And they estimate there was about 30 foreign fighters that made their way back to the Philippines, so a relatively small number. The theme of today is that small numbers of ISIS leaders are attempting to leverage local insurgencies. And so we see in Africa a number of local insurgencies that rebranded themselves and pledged allegiance to ISIS, over the past year. And then what we're looking for is the small number of foreign fighters leadership that may try to make their way to what we call safe havens. What today's discussion was all about was information intelligence sharing about the movement of these individuals so we can prepare local forces to deal with the challenges associated with coming back. There's even yesterday, it's kind of a hint that you expect to see large flows of ISIS fighters coming out of Syria and Iraq. We don't see that at all. We don't see large numbers of fighters coming out of Syria and Iraq. The numbers that we've seen other places, to the extent that they have come from Syria and Iraq, are fairly small numbers. Again, what we're really dealing with are largely local insurgencies.